Directors, we have Mick Garrison and Tom Holland, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
He's Tom, the maestro. It amazes me how well this movie holds up. If it were made now, it seems like the studio would insist that a killer doll movie would be PG-13. And this is really brutal. And the brutality is still brutal today. What did you make of it? Because I know you rewrote the script heavily when you got it. How did you make it into a Tom Holland film?
Well, first I want to thank all of you for coming out on this night that was so intimidating.
They couldn't afford the Obama.
I mean, I was thinking it would be like 3, 4, 5 hours to get here, and so I'm thrilled that as many of you came out as you did. How did I turn it into? It didn't have the original script was more of a episode of Twilight Zone. The Telly Savalas one where the doll, and so the question was how to make it for a mass audience where you could identify with it and care about the travails of the mother and the little boy. And it just seemed to me that if the doll was really evil, then, and I knew it was a leap, but if somehow you cared, if somehow there were a series of murders and they blamed the little boy, and the mother had to save her adolescent, her child. That was, I know it sounds old-fashioned and melodramatic, but it was a very, very strong dramatic situation. And it seemed perfect to do that because of the doll. And so I created the character of Charles Lee Ray, which is the killer that inhabits the doll. And that was a reach, because if you start to think about it, chanting and passing your soul into that of the doll is rather silly. But I had some wonderful actors, including, Brad, to do the killer, and then the doll's voice, and the situation was so compelling. I think it was so much fun that it really, really worked. And this one worked from the first time we cut it.
Really?
Yeah. It was long, and it had bumps, and it went into sentimentality at one point, but it always worked. You could feel it.
Well, I haven't seen it in a theater since it opened. When I went like opening weekend, like everybody else did, and it just holds up really well. This was a beautiful print, and I was also impressed by the color palette because it's got a very broad color palette, and so many films at that time and now are so muted and very monochromatic. And talk a little about the color choices, because the Chucky doll has a whole rainbow of color.
We'll give credit to John DeCure Sr. and John DeCure Jr. John DeCure Sr. was the production designer. He was just famous in Hollywood. I inherited him after Ghostbusters, but he had done Cleopatra, and he had done King and I. He was the resident production designer at 20th under Zanuck, the old man, and he was elderly when Columbia, in their wisdom, gave him to me on Fright Night, and he carried over into the setting up of Child's Play, and that's where so much of the apartment building that she falls out is Gothic. That's John DeCure. The toy store, the color palette of Chucky. That's really a Raggedy Ann doll run crazy. But it's still those doll colors. So much of that was John, and then Bill Butler shot it. But I got to tell you, because I had a terrific guy doing it.
Well, that's another point I was going to make. You had these really top artisans doing a horror movie, which this is unapologetically a horror movie, and that was not common in the 80s to get the top studio guys to do this.
They didn't know. They didn't know. I mean, because he started out asking about how we made our movies in those days. Because at that moment in time, our movies were making money, and PG or PG-13 were considered, for little kids. And I had tried before that with Cloak and Dagger, and that I think had a PG-13 rating on it, but you could push it. Then you could push it for 5 minutes. You could push it, and then I got wiped out later for pushing it in the film called The Temp, which was absolutely eviscerated of all the horror elements. So by then, by the early
It was Temp horror.
Yeah, Temp horror. By the earlier mid-90s, it closed down. But there was that moment from about 84 to 87. This was made 87 or 88, where you could do R. Now, how I got away with kids, I don't know. Yeah. Because the story behind this is I was castigated. I've got great reviews here in the New York Times and such. But I was castigated in England and the UK. And there was a letter writing program against the movie from grade schoolers that their teachers organized. And there was a double murder of children by other children in England, and they tried to blame it on child's play. And so
that was very controversial at the time worldwide.
Okay, then also I made this for UA, originally, my memory. Then it was UA MGM was taken over by a white-collar criminal, and he was an Australian, and the name may have been Skazi or something like that. And he owned MGM for 30 seconds, and in a fit of total hypocrisy and horrible business sense, because this movie was offensive to him, because it was children's playthings, and to prove what a wonderful, upstanding family man he was, he sold the rights to Universal. And all of the sequels were made by Universal, but the rights to the remake of Child's Play still are with UAMGM. That's a true story. So at the moment that it was made, it was possible, and then even a couple of years later, it was swinging against it big time, where the studio literally sold it off because they didn't want to have, because it had become at that point so notorious.
Let's go back to how you became a filmmaker in the first place. You were an actor originally.
Originally, yes.
Who became a writer.
Yes.
With Psycho 2 was really your claim to fame as a writer. Nobody expected a sequel to Psycho to be any good. And here comes this terrific, surprisingly wonderful sequel all those years later, over 20 years later. And so I assume that opened up opportunities for you as a director.
Yes, it did. There was Psycho 2 was because of a wonderful director named Richard Franklin, and his widow is here in the audience tonight somewhere from Australia. But Richard did Road Games and Patrick and Psycho 2. Psycho 2 really opened it up. But I'd had fitful success as a writer before that. I'd done Initiation of Sarah, which was the movie of the week. And this was the first wet t-shirt movie on ABC. And they were so outraged.
Jiggle television in those days.
But it was the beginning of it. And they were so outraged that it was the cover of the calendar section in the LA Times. For those who remember when they still read the LA Times in print. And that was that introduced Morgan Fairchild. And so that was my first notoriety anyway as a writer. Then I had The Beast Within. And this is after spending like 6, 7, 8 years trying to...
I was a publicist of The Beast Within.
Okay. And I thought the script was wonderful, and I think the movie's terrific, and they're all friends, and it didn't make a dime. And I couldn't get a job for a year. And then by happenstance, and God bless Richard Franklin, he hired me for Psycho 2. And nobody wanted to touch it. Everybody thought it was a career wrecker. Anybody who tried to mess with Psycho, which was iconic even then, only very, very iconic actually, that you were just going to be creatively destroyed. I mean, review-wise destroyed. And I think we were so worried about that we worked harder than I ever had before, up till then anyway, in a script.
And Richard Franklin was also a Hitchcock scholar.
Richard Franklin knew more about Hitchcock than Hitchcock. There was a whole generation that came out of USC. There was Lucas and, I can't think of, there was a whole generation, I can't think of all of them. But Richard, Yeah, Randall Kleiser. Who else? Richard Franklin produced the Randall's movie on the island.
Right, Blue Lagoon.
Blue Lagoon. They were all USC graduates. Anyway, that was, that Psycho 2. Psycho 2 started out as a cable movie, for a group called Low Communications in San Diego.
They had on TV at the time.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. And they didn't think that it deserved a theatrical release. And the trick was to write a script that was strong enough to get Tony Perkins to commit to make it. And I realized that I made Norman sympathetic, which is what everybody wanted anyway. That there was a chance I could get Tony. I did. Tony said yes. Universal was still making it as a cable movie, and they announced it. And there was this huge worldwide interest in seeing Tony Perkins do Norman again. And that was the beginning of what turned into maybe the biggest horror movie of that summer, or the biggest movie of that. It was just enormous. And the movie cost nothing. Psycho 2 was like $3.8 million on the lot.
Yeah. I remember I was in publicity at Universal at the time, and I remember that the script distributed did not have the last couple pages. So no one knew how it ended, and even the studio executives weren't allowed to see it other than the very top brass. So how did that go?
That was Richard, and Richard was doing a Hitchcock. Richard not only had studied Hitchcock, he'd known him, and had come up from USC to interview him on the set of Topaz. And so I could go on and on about Psycho. The shots in Psycho reference there was a visual set piece that referenced like 6, 7, or 8 of Hitchcock's movies in terms of what he did with the camera. There's a silhouette on the wall of Hitchcock because he always appeared in every one of his movies. And Richard put him in the wall in the movie.
Yeah, a great history. I actually directed Psycho 4.
You did. I'm sorry. And he has mother. He has mother in his office.
Yes, she's sitting there placidly. Actually, I had the neighbor lady across the street.
Yes. Yeah, famous story.
Called the police because there was a corpse in my office. She could see it right through the window. So now all the children in the neighborhood, they come knock on the door. Can we see Mother? It's really, it's made me very popular.